Sometimes a single moment changes everything. Sometimes that moment happens in a place where dust swirls around weathered boots and the sun beats down mercilessly on a crowd hungry for blood. Sometimes it takes just one voice to silence 100 others, and sometimes that voice belongs to a man who has more to lose than anyone else in that dusty square. This is the story of Thomas Mitchell, a cattle rancher who owned half the county but risked it all for a stranger. It's about the day when doing what's right meant standing against everyone you called neighbor, friend, and family. It's about how courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite the trembling in your hands and the knowledge that your world might crumble with your next words. In 1952, in a small Texas town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where justice often came from the barrel of a gun rather than the gavel of a judge, one man's plea in a dusty town square would echo through generations. This is that story. The morning sun painted the Texas sky the color of rust as Thomas Mitchell guided his horse through the gates of his sprawling ranch. At 42, he carried the weight of 3 generations of Mitchell land on his shoulders, and every sunrise reminded him of the responsibility that came with owning nearly 10,000 acres of prime cattle country. The Lazy M Ranch wasn't just his livelihood, it was his legacy, his identity, and the foundation upon which the entire town of Harmony Springs had been built. Thomas had inherited more than land from his father and grandfather. He'd inherited respect, influence, and a reputation that opened doors throughout the county. When Thomas Mitchell spoke, people listened. When he made a decision, it rippled through the community like stones thrown into still water. His word carried the weight of generations, and his handshake was better than any contract drawn up by the finest lawyers in Austin. That morning, as he rode toward town for the weekly cattle auction, Thomas had no idea that by sunset, everything he'd built and inherited would hang in the balance. He certainly couldn't have predicted that he'd find himself standing against nearly every soul in Harmony Springs, defending a man he'd never met before that very day. The town square buzzed with its usual Thursday morning energy as merchants opened their shops and farmers gathered to discuss crops and weather. The courthouse, an imposing structure of red brick and white columns, dominated the square like a monument to order and civilization. Around it, the buildings of Harmony Springs told the story of a prosperous cattle town, the First National Bank with its polished windows, Murphy's General Store with its wide front porch lined with rocking chairs, and the Cattleman's Saloon where deals were made over whiskey and handshakes. Thomas tied his horse to the hitching post outside Murphy's and tipped his hat to Mrs. Henderson, who was sweeping the front steps of her boarding house. He'd known Martha Henderson since childhood, just as he knew virtually every face in Harmony Springs. It was a place where your family name mattered, where your word was your bond, and where strangers were viewed with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "Morning, Thomas," called out Sheriff Frank Garrett from across the square. Frank had held the badge for 15 years, and, like most men in positions of authority in Harmony Springs, he understood that keeping the peace often meant keeping Thomas Mitchell satisfied. The two men had grown up together, gone to school together, and built their adult lives in parallel tracks of mutual respect and benefit. "Morning, Frank," Thomas replied, noting the unusual tension in his old friend's voice. "Everything all right?" Sheriff Garrett glanced around the square before lowering his voice. "Might have some trouble brewing. Got word that Marcus Webb is coming through town today." The name hit Thomas like a physical blow. Marcus Webb, the notorious cattle rustler who'd been terrorizing ranches throughout central Texas for the better part of 2 years. Webb and his gang had cost Thomas personally, stealing nearly 50 head of prime beef cattle just 6 months earlier. The theft had meant more than financial loss, it had been an insult, a violation of the natural order that said a man's property was sacred. "You sure about this?" Thomas asked, his hand unconsciously moving to rest on his gun belt. "Ryder came in from Millerville last night. Webb's been spotted heading this way with at least 3 of his men. Could be more." Sheriff Garrett spat into the dust. "Word's already spreading. Men are getting their guns ready." Thomas felt the familiar surge of righteous anger that came with thoughts of Marcus Webb. The man represented everything Thomas despised about the lawless elements that still plagued Texas in these modern times. While honest men like Thomas built communities and raised families, men like Webb took what they wanted through violence and intimidation. "What's your plan, Frank?" Thomas asked. "Well, that's just it," the sheriff said, shifting uncomfortably. "By law, I can't just shoot the man on sight. Need evidence, need a proper arrest. But, you know how folks feel about Webb around here. Thomas knew indeed. Webb had stolen from at least a dozen ranchers in the county, and his name was spoken with the kind of venom usually reserved for rattlesnakes and drought. If Webb rode into Harmony Springs, he wouldn't receive anything resembling a fair trial or due process. He'd be lucky if he lived long enough to see the inside of a jail cell. The men are already talking, Sheriff Garrett continued. They're saying if I can't handle Webb proper, they'll handle him their way. As if summoned by their conversation, a group of men emerged from the cattleman's saloon. Thomas recognized each face: ranchers, shop owners, farmers, all men whose lives had been touched by Webb's crimes either directly or through friends and neighbors. Leading them was Big Jim Hawkins, whose own ranch had been hit by Webb's gang just 2 months earlier. Thomas! Big Jim called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being heard. Glad you're here. We need to talk. The group surrounded Thomas and Sheriff Garrett in a loose circle, their faces grim and determined. These were men Thomas had known for decades, men he'd done business with, men whose families had intermarried with his own extended clan over the years. They were the pillars of Harmony Springs society, and their unity on any issue usually meant swift and decisive action. We've got word Webb's coming, said Carl Morrison, who owned the hardware store and served as the informal leader of the Merchants Association. This time, we're going to be ready for him. Ready how? Thomas asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Ready to give him the justice he deserves, replied Pete Williams, whose younger brother had been shot during Webb's raid on the Williams family ranch. That snake has been slithering around Texas long enough. Time somebody put him down permanent. A murmur of agreement rippled through the group. Thomas could see the bloodlust in their eyes, the way their hands rested easy on their gun belts, the set of their jaws that said they'd made up their minds and wouldn't be swayed by argument or reason. Now hold on, Sheriff Garrett interjected. I'm still the law in this town, and I'll handle Marcus Webb according to the law. Big Jim Hawkins laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Frank, you're a good man, but the law hasn't done much to stop Webb so far. How many ranches does he have to hit before somebody does what needs doing? Jim's right, added Tom Bradley, whose cattle had been among those stolen from Thomas's ranch. Webb's made fools of us all. Made fools of the law, made fools of honest men trying to make an honest living. Time to show him what happens when you steal from the wrong people. Thomas felt the weight of expectation in their gazes. As the largest landowner in the county, his voice carried enormous influence in any decision the group might make. If Thomas Mitchell said Marcus Webb deserved to hang, then Marcus Webb would hang, law or no law. If Thomas called for vigilante justice, then vigilante justice would be swift and final. The irony wasn't lost on him. For years, Thomas had been the voice of order and civilization in Harmony Springs. He'd helped establish the first real school, had donated land for the church, and had always maintained that the law was the foundation upon which their community stood. Yet now, faced with a man who had personally wronged him and threatened everything he'd built, the temptation to abandon those principles burned in his chest like swallowed fire. What exactly are you boys proposing? Thomas asked carefully. Simple, said Pete Williams. We know Webb's coming. We know he's guilty of more crimes than we can count. Instead of waiting for him to hit another ranch or shoot another innocent man, we finish this today. For good. You're talking about murder, Sheriff Garrett said flatly. We're talking about justice, Big Jim corrected. Justice that's been a long time coming. Thomas, you've lost more cattle to Webb than any of us. You know what this man has cost our community. Are you going to stand with us, or are you going to let him ride away to steal and kill again? The question hung in the dusty air like smoke from a distant fire. Around the circle, hardened men waited for Thomas's answer, knowing that his decision would determine not just Marcus Webb's fate, but the future of law and order in Harmony Springs. Some looked eager, their faces flushed with the anticipation of righteous vengeance. Others appeared more troubled, as if they understood the implications of what they were proposing but felt driven by desperation and anger to consider it anyway. Thomas looked at each face in turn, seeing neighbors and friends, seeing men he trusted with his business and his family's safety. These weren't bad men or natural killers. They were farmers and ranchers and shopkeepers who'd been pushed beyond their limits by a man who represented everything that threatened their way of life. "I need to think about this," Thomas said finally. Big Jim Hawkins stepped closer, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. "Thomas, I know you're a man who believes in doing things proper. We all respect that about you. But sometimes proper doesn't work. Sometimes a man has to choose between what's legal and what's right." "And you're sure Webb's coming today?" Thomas asked. "Sure as sunrise," Pete Williams confirmed. "Writer who brought word says Webb's got business in town. Something about collecting a debt from someone here. He'll be writing in bold as brass, probably thinking we're all too scared to face him." Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. If Webb was coming to collect a debt, it meant he had some kind of leverage over someone in Harmony Springs. It meant the outlaws' influence had already infected their community like poison in a well. "Who owes him money?" Thomas demanded. The men exchanged glances, and Sheriff Garrett cleared his throat uncomfortably. "That's still being determined," he said evasively. But Big Jim Hawkins had no patience for diplomatic answers. "Word is it's connected to that new family, the Rodriguezes. Something about the father owing Webb money from before they moved here." Thomas's blood chilled. The Rodriguez family had arrived in Harmony Springs just 3 months earlier, refugees from some trouble down south near the Mexican border. Eduardo Rodriguez worked as a blacksmith and farrier, skilled labor that the town needed. His wife Maria took in washing and mending, and their 2 young children had quickly integrated into the small school. They were quiet, hard-working people who kept to themselves and caused no trouble. But if Eduardo Rodriguez owed money to Marcus Webb, then the man's arrival would bring danger to more than just the adult male population of Harmony Springs. It would threaten innocent women and children, and it would turn the community's central square into a potential battlefield. "How much does he owe?" Thomas asked. "Doesn't matter," said Carl Morrison grimly. "What matters is that Webb's using it as an excuse to ride into our town with his guns and his men. That makes it our business, debt or no debt." Sheriff Garrett shifted his weight from foot to foot. "Boys, I understand your feelings, but if we take the law into our own hands, we're no better than Webb himself. We've got to maintain order, maintain civilization. Otherwise, what are we fighting to protect? We're fighting to protect our families, our property, and our lives," Big Jim shot back. "And sometimes that means getting your hands dirty." Thomas watched the debate continue, but his mind was already racing ahead to the implications of what was being proposed. If the men of Harmony Springs lynched Marcus Webb in the town square, the news would spread throughout Texas like wildfire. It would bring attention from Austin, possibly federal attention. It might mean investigations, arrests, trials. It could destroy the careful reputation that Harmony Springs had built as a civilized, law-abiding community. But if they let Webb ride in and conduct his business unopposed, it would send a different kind of message. It would tell every outlaw and desperado in Texas that Harmony Springs was soft, that its people could be intimidated and robbed with impunity. It might invite more predators to test their defenses. "When's he supposed to arrive?" Thomas asked. "Sometime this afternoon," according to the writer, Sheriff Garrett replied. "I've already sent word to the county seat, asking for backup deputies, but they won't arrive until tomorrow at the earliest." "Tomorrow won't help us today," Pete Williams said bitterly. "We're on our own, just like always." Thomas made his decision with the sudden clarity that had served him well in business and ranching for over 20 years. "I'll stand with you," he told the group. "But we do this smart. We don't just gun him down in cold blood. We give him a chance to surrender, to face proper justice. If he chooses to fight, then we finish it." The men around him nodded with grim satisfaction. Sheriff Garrett looked troubled but didn't voice further objection. In the hierarchy of influence that governed small towns, Thomas Mitchell's word carried more weight than any badge. "Good," said Big Jim Hawkins, extending his hand to Thomas. I knew we could count on you. Now, let's talk about how we're going to handle this." As the morning sun climbed higher into the Texas sky, the group of men began planning what they believed would be the final confrontation with Marcus Webb. None of them suspected that before the day was over, Thomas Mitchell would find himself standing alone against all of them, defending the very man they'd gathered to destroy. The seeds of that confrontation were already being planted in a small adobe house on the Mexican side of Harmony Springs, where Eduardo Rodriguez sat at his kitchen table, staring at a letter that had arrived the night before. The letter bore Marcus Webb's name, and its contents would soon force Thomas Mitchell to choose between everything he'd inherited and everything he believed. By noon, the atmosphere in Harmony Springs had transformed from morning routine to barely contained tension. Word of Marcus Webb's impending arrival had spread through the town like water through parched ground, and the response was immediate and unmistakable. Windows that normally stood open were shuttered tight. Children who usually played in the streets were called inside by anxious mothers. The few women who ventured out moved quickly between buildings, their faces pale with worry. Thomas Mitchell stood in the doorway of Murphy's General Store, watching the town prepare for war. Along the rooflines of buildings surrounding the square, he could see the glint of rifle barrels as men took positions. Sheriff Garrett had positioned himself behind the water trough near the courthouse steps, his shotgun loaded and ready. Big Jim Hawkins and his crew had spread out across the square in a loose semicircle, their revolvers checked and rechecked. The plan was simple and brutal in its efficiency. When Marcus Webb rode into the square, he would find himself surrounded by armed men with clear fields of fire. Sheriff Garrett would call for his surrender, and if Webb so much as moved toward his gun, he would be cut down in a crossfire that would leave no room for error or escape. It was, Thomas had to admit, a solid tactical plan. It minimized risk to the townspeople and maximized the chances of ending Marcus Webb's reign of terror permanently. Every logical part of his mind told him that this was the right choice, the necessary choice, the choice that would protect his community and his family. But, as he watched his neighbors and friends take their positions like soldiers preparing for battle, something nagged at the edge of his consciousness. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right, though he couldn't quite identify what was bothering him. "Thomas," a voice called softly from behind him. He turned to see Maria Rodriguez approaching, her dark eyes wide with fear and something else, desperation, perhaps, or hope. Maria Rodriguez was a small woman in her 30s, with the weathered hands of someone accustomed to hard work and the quiet dignity of someone who had endured hardship without complaint. She moved like a person trying not to be noticed, glancing nervously at the armed men positioned around the square. "Señora Rodriguez," Thomas said, removing his hat in a gesture of respect that was second nature to him when addressing a lady. "You should be indoors with your children. There's going to be trouble here soon." "That is what I must speak to you about," she said, her heavily accented English careful and precise. "This trouble, it is not what you think. Por favor, you must listen to what I tell you." Thomas glanced around the square, noting that several of his fellow conspirators were watching his conversation with interest. Maria Rodriguez was connected to Marcus Webb through her husband's debt, which made her a figure of suspicion in the current climate. "Ma'am, I don't think this is the right time," he began. "There is no time," she interrupted, then caught herself and lowered her voice. "Señor Mitchell, you are a powerful man, a respected man. People listen to you. You must hear the truth before you make a terrible mistake." Something in her tone, a note of genuine urgency that transcended the language barrier, made Thomas pause. He looked into her eyes and saw not the fear of a woman whose husband was involved with criminals, but the desperate determination of a mother protecting her family. "What truth?" he asked quietly. Maria glanced around again, then stepped closer. "My husband, he does not owe Marcus Webb money. Webb, he says my husband stole from him, but it is a lie. Eduardo, he never stole anything in his life. This debt Webb speaks of, it is not real." Thomas felt a cold finger of doubt trace down his spine. "Then, why is Webb coming here? Why does he say your husband owes him money?" Tears began to form in Maria's eyes. "Because Webb, he knows what my husband witnessed in Millerville, before we came here. Eduardo, he saw Webb and his men kill a family. An entire family, even the children. Webb knows that Eduardo can testify against him if there is ever a trial. The world seemed to shift slightly under Thomas's feet. Are you saying Webb is coming here to kill your husband? To silence him? See, Maria whispered. He uses this lie about money to make it seem like business, like justice. But, really, he comes to murder the only man who can prove what kind of monster he truly is. Thomas stared at the small woman before him, his mind racing through the implications of what she was telling him. If she was right, then, the men of Harmony Springs were about to help Marcus Webb commit murder by standing aside while he killed Eduardo Rodriguez under the pretense of collecting a debt. But, another part of his mind rebelled against accepting her story. Maria Rodriguez was a stranger, a Mexican woman whose husband might indeed be a criminal. Her word against the established facts as understood by every respectable man in town seemed like thin evidence on which to base such a momentous decision. Why should I believe you? Thomas asked, hating himself for the bluntness of the question but needing to hear her answer. Maria reached into her apron and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a child's wooden toy, a small horse carved with obvious love and attention to detail. This belonged to little Ana Morales, she said softly. 7 years old. She was playing with it when Webb and his men broke into her family's house in Millerville. Eduardo, he found it in the dirt outside after. She couldn't finish the sentence. Thomas took the wooden horse, feeling its smooth surfaces and noting the careful craftsmanship. It was the kind of toy a father would carve for his daughter during long winter evenings, the kind of simple treasure that represented a family's love and hope for the future. Eduardo buried the Morales family with his own hands, Maria continued. He carved crosses for their graves and said prayers over them. He took this toy to remember them, to make sure their deaths would not be forgotten if he ever got the chance to tell the world what he witnessed. The wooden horse seemed to grow heavier in Thomas's hands. Why didn't your husband go to the law in Millerville? Why didn't he report what he saw? Maria's laugh was bitter and without humor. The sheriff in Millerville, he is Webb's cousin. The judge, he owes Webb money from gambling debts. Eduardo tried to speak the truth, but no one would listen. They said he was a crazy Mexican making up stories. That is when we decided to leave, to come here where maybe honest men would believe the truth. Thomas felt the foundation of his certainties beginning to crack. Everything he thought he knew about the situation was being turned upside down by this small woman's desperate testimony. If she was telling the truth, then Marcus Webb wasn't just a cattle rustler to be dealt with by vigilante justice. He was a cold-blooded killer who murdered entire families, and he was coming to Harmony Springs to add Eduardo Rodriguez to his list of victims. Even if what you're saying is true, Thomas said slowly, Webb is still a criminal. He's still stolen cattle from dozens of ranchers, including me. Even if he's coming here to kill your husband instead of collecting a debt, that doesn't make him any less dangerous to our community. No, Maria agreed. But it makes him more dangerous than you know. If he kills Eduardo today, he will know that he can kill anyone, anywhere, and make it look like justice. Today it is my husband. Tomorrow it could be anyone who stands in his way or sees too much of his business. Thomas understood the implication immediately. If Webb could manipulate an entire town into standing aside while he committed murder, then no one would ever be safe from his reach. The man's power would extend far beyond his guns and his gang to encompass the very concepts of law and justice themselves. What do you want me to do? Thomas asked. Protect my husband, Maria said simply. When Webb comes, do not let him take Eduardo away. Make him face real law, real justice. Make him answer for all his crimes, not just steal cattle but murder of innocents. Before Thomas could respond, a shout rang out across the square. Riders coming, called Pete Williams from his position on the roof of the bank. 4 men, riding hard from the south. Thomas handed the wooden horse back to Maria Rodriguez and moved to the edge of the store's covered porch. In the distance, he could see a cloud of dust approaching the town, and within it the dark shapes of 4 horsemen riding at a steady but unhurried pace. Marcus Webb had arrived. The transformation of the square was instantaneous. Men who had been talking quietly or checking their weapons suddenly became focused and deadly serious. Rifle barrels appeared in windows. Revolvers were drawn and cocked. The very air seemed to thicken with tension and the promise of violence. Sheriff Garrett emerged from behind the water trough and took his position in the center of the square, his badge glinting in the afternoon sun. His face was pale but determined, and his hands were steady on his shotgun. "Remember," Big Jim Hawkins called softly to the assembled men, "nobody shoots until I give the word. We give him a chance to surrender, just like we agreed." Thomas noticed that several of the men were now looking at him expectantly, waiting for his final confirmation that they were doing the right thing. As the largest landowner and most influential citizen, his blessing would make them feel justified in whatever followed. But, as the riders drew closer, Thomas found himself thinking not about his stolen cattle or Webb's crimes against property, but about a 7-year-old girl named Ana Morales who had died playing with a wooden horse. He thought about Eduardo Rodriguez, a man he barely knew who might be the only witness to a family's slaughter. He thought about the difference between justice and vengeance, between law and mob rule. The riders entered the square at a walk, their horses' hooves echoing off the buildings like slow drumbeats. Marcus Webb rode in front, exactly as Thomas had imagined him, a lean, hard-faced man in his 40s with cold eyes and the easy posture of someone accustomed to violence. His 3 companions spread out slightly as they approached, their own hands resting casually on their gun belts. Webb's gaze swept the square, taking in the positions of the armed men with the cool assessment of a professional killer. If he was surprised or concerned by the reception committee, he gave no sign of it. Instead, he reined in his horse about 20 feet from Sheriff Garrett and touched the brim of his hat in a mockery of polite greeting. "Sheriff," Webb said, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "Fine day for conducting business, don't you think?" "Marcus Webb," Sheriff Garrett replied, his voice steady despite the obvious tension. "You're under arrest for cattle rustling and numerous other crimes against the people of this county." Webb smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Now, Sheriff, that's not very friendly. I haven't come here to cause trouble. Just came to collect what's owed to me by Eduardo Rodriguez. Simple business transaction." "There's nothing simple about it," Thomas heard himself saying as he stepped down from the store porch into the square. Every eye in the square turned to him, and he felt the weight of their attention like a physical force. Webb's cold gaze fixed on Thomas, and the outlaw's smile widened slightly. "Thomas Mitchell, isn't it? Heard you lost some cattle to rustlers a while back. Terrible thing, that. Man's livestock is his livelihood." The casual mention of his stolen cattle sent a surge of anger through Thomas, but he forced himself to remain calm. "I did lose cattle, Webb. Question is whether you're here to steal more or whether you're here for something else entirely." "Not sure what you mean by that," Webb replied, though his eyes had sharpened with interest. "I'm just here to see Eduardo Rodriguez about a debt. Man borrowed money from me down in Millerville, and it's time to settle up." Thomas stepped closer to the center of the square, positioning himself between Webb and the direction of the Rodriguez house. "Funny thing about that debt," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Word is there never was any money borrowed. Word is you're here to kill a man who witnessed you murder a family." The silence that followed Thomas's words was absolute. Even the horses seemed to sense the tension and stood perfectly still. Webb's smile finally faded, replaced by an expression of cold calculation. "That's a serious accusation, Mitchell," Webb said softly. "Man could get hurt making accusations like that without proof." "The proof is walking around town right now," Thomas replied. "Eduardo Rodriguez saw what you did to the Morales family. He can testify to it in a court of law, and you know it." Big Jim Hawkins stepped forward from his position, confusion evident on his face. "Thomas, what are you talking about? What's this about a family?" Thomas kept his eyes on Webb as he answered. "It's about a 7-year-old girl named Ana Morales who was murdered along with her entire family by this man and his gang. It's about Eduardo Rodriguez being the only witness who can prove it. And it's about us being manipulated into standing aside while Webb commits another murder." The men around the square began to murmur among themselves, their certainty shaken by this new information. Sheriff Garrett looked confused but maintained his position, his shotgun still trained on Webb. Webb, meanwhile, had gone very still in his saddle, his hand hovering near his gun. When he spoke, his voice was like winter wine through bare branches. "You're making a big mistake, Mitchell. Whatever lies that Mexican has been telling you, they're just that, lies. Eduardo Rodriguez owes me money, and I aim to collect it. Whether you boys want to interfere with legal business is up to you." "Legal?" Thomas laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Since when is murder legal business, Webb?" The outlaw's mask finally slipped completely, and his face showed the cold fury of a killer who had been backed into a corner. "You don't know what you're messing with, rancher. You think your money and your name make you safe? Think again." Thomas felt fear crawl up his spine like ice, but he also felt something else, a clarity of purpose that he had never experienced before. For the first time in his life, he was standing for something more important than property or profit or even personal safety. He was standing for the principle that innocent people should not be murdered while good men watched and did nothing. "Maybe I don't know what I'm messing with," Thomas said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "But I know what's right. And what's right is that Eduardo Rodriguez gets his day in court, not a bullet in the back." Around the square, the armed men of Harmony Springs found themselves caught in an impossible position. They had come here to support Thomas Mitchell in dispensing justice to a known criminal. Now their leader was apparently defending that same criminal's intended victim, and everything they thought they understood about the situation had been turned upside down. Webb's hand moved closer to his gun. "Last chance, Mitchell. Step aside and let me conduct my business, or face the consequences." Thomas Mitchell, heir to 3 generations of cattle ranching legacy, owner of 10,000 acres of prime Texas land, and the most influential man in Harmony Springs, made his choice. He stepped forward instead of aside, placing himself directly between Marcus Webb and any path that might lead to Eduardo Rodriguez. "No," he said simply. "You'll have to go through me." The moment stretched like a wire pulled to its breaking point. Thomas Mitchell stood alone in the center of the dusty square, facing down Marcus Webb while the men he had called friends and neighbors watched in stunned confusion. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, creating sharp shadows that divided the world into stark contrasts of light and dark, much like the moral choice that had split the community. Sheriff Garrett was the first to break the tableau, stepping slightly to the side so his shotgun covered both Webb and his men. "Thomas," he said carefully, "I need you to explain what's going on here. If you've got information about other crimes, I need to hear it." But before Thomas could answer, Big Jim Hawkins exploded with frustrated anger. "Thomas, what in the hell are you doing? This man has stolen from every rancher in the county, including you. Are you going to stand there and protect him?" "I'm not protecting Webb," Thomas replied without taking his eyes off the outlaw. "I'm protecting an innocent man from being murdered by him." Webb's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. "Innocent? Eduardo Rodriguez is a thief and a liar, just like every other Mexican that ever crossed the border. He stole from me, and now he's going to pay for it." "With his life?" Thomas asked. "That's not justice, Webb. That's execution." Pete Williams stepped forward from his position, his revolver already drawn. "Thomas, I don't know what that Mexican woman told you, but think about this. Webb and his gang shot my brother. They stole your cattle and mine and every other honest rancher's in this county. Why are you taking their side against us?" The question hit Thomas like a physical blow because it forced him to confront the terrible mathematics of his choice. On one side stood Marcus Webb, a man who had indeed stolen from him and terrorized his community. On the other side stood Eduardo Rodriguez, a man Thomas barely knew who might or might not be telling the truth about witnessing a murder. Between them stood Thomas himself, risking everything he had built and inherited for the sake of a principle that seemed increasingly abstract in the face of his neighbor's anger and confusion. "I'm not taking anybody's side," Thomas said, his voice carrying across the square. "I'm trying to make sure we don't become something we'll regret being." Carl Morrison, the hardware store owner, pushed his way through the crowd of armed men. "Thomas, you're talking in riddles. We came here to stop a criminal, and that's what we're going to do. Now step aside and let us finish this." But Thomas held his ground, even as he felt the support of his community crumbling around him. "If we gun down Webb without a trial, we're murderers. If we let Webb gun down Rodriguez without stopping him, we're accomplices to murder. Either way, we stop being the kind of people who deserve to call ourselves civilized." Webb's hand had moved to rest on the butt of his revolver, and his voice took on a mocking tone. "Listen to him, boys. Thomas Mitchell wants to hold court right here in the street. Maybe we should get the preacher to say a few words over my grave too." "There's not going to be any grave," Sheriff Garrett said firmly. "Webb, you're under arrest. Dismount and surrender your weapons." "On what charges?" Webb demanded. "Cattle rustling, for starters," the sheriff replied. "And if what Thomas says is true, maybe murder as well." Webb's smile returned, but it was the cold expression of a predator who had decided his prey was cornered. "You boys have been listening to too many Mexican fairy tales. Eduardo Rodriguez owes me money, and I aim to collect it. Nothing more complicated than that." "Then, you won't mind if we settle this in court," Thomas said. "If Rodriguez really owes you money, a judge can sort it out proper." "I'm not interested in what some bought judge thinks about my business," Webb replied. "I handle my own affairs." The standoff was broken by an unexpected voice from the edge of the square. "Señor Webb." Every head turned to see Eduardo Rodriguez walking toward them from the direction of his small house. He was a compact man in his 30s with calloused hands and serious dark eyes, moving with the careful dignity of someone who knew he was walking into mortal danger but felt compelled to do it anyway. Behind him, despite Thomas's earlier warning, Maria Rodriguez followed at a distance, her face pale with terror but her step resolute. "Eduardo, no," she called out. "Go back to the house." But her husband continued walking until he stood about 10 feet from the confrontation, his hands empty and visible, his gaze fixed on Marcus Webb. "I have no debt with you," Eduardo said in English that was careful but clear. "I have never borrowed money from you. I have never stolen from you. You know this." Webb's facade of civilized conduct finally cracked completely. "You lying greaser. You stole $50 from me in Millerville, and you're going to pay it back with interest." "I stole nothing," Eduardo replied calmly. "But I saw you kill the Morales family. I saw you shoot Pablo Morales when he begged for his children's lives. I saw you laugh when little Anna tried to hide behind her madre's skirts." The impact of these words on the assembled crowd was immediate and profound. The men of Harmony Springs were no strangers to violence. They lived on what was still essentially a frontier, but the image of children being murdered while their parents watched was something that struck at the core of every father and husband present. Big Jim Hawkins lowered his revolver slightly. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "Is that true?" Webb's hand was now gripping his gun openly, his pretense of legal business abandoned. "That Mexican is lying through his teeth. He's trying to save his own skin by making up stories about things that never happened." "The Morales family happened," Eduardo said quietly. "They had a small farm outside Millerville. Pablo grew corn and beans. Ana liked to help her madre with the cooking. Little Miguel was just learning to walk." The specificity of the details, delivered in Eduardo's steady voice, carried a weight of truth that no amount of denial could dispel. Thomas felt vindicated in his choice, but he also felt the terrible weight of what they were all facing. "Even if that's true," Pete Williams said, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction, "we still can't just let Webb right away. He's still guilty of rustling our cattle." "I'm not suggesting we let him right away," Thomas replied. "I'm suggesting we arrest him properly and let the law handle this." Webb's laugh was harsh and bitter. "The law? Which law would that be, rancher? The law that says a Mexican's word is worth something against a white man's? The law that says cattle thieves should get a fair trial instead of a short rope? You're all fools if you think any judge is going to convict me on the word of a greaser and a bunch of farmers." Sheriff Garrett stepped forward, his shotgun never wavering from Webb's position. "Maybe not, but that's not our decision to make. My job is to arrest criminals and let the courts sort out guilt and innocence. Your job, Webb said with a sneer, is to stay out of my way while I conduct my business. Otherwise, you might find yourself facing the same kind of unfortunate accident that befell the Morales family. The threat was so blatant, so openly contemptuous of law and decency, that it seemed to crystallize something in the minds of the watching men. Thomas saw the change in their faces, the shift from anger at him to revulsion at Webb, the gradual understanding that they were dealing with something far more dangerous than a simple cattle rustler. But Webb had made a fatal miscalculation in revealing his true nature so completely. By threatening Sheriff Garrett openly and describing the murder of a family as an unfortunate accident, he had shown himself to be exactly the monster that Eduardo Rodriguez claimed him to be. Carl Morrison was the first to voice what they were all thinking. Sweet Jesus, Thomas is right. This man is talking about murdering families like it's nothing more than swatting flies. And he's threatening Frank, added Tom Bradley, referring to Sheriff Garrett. Nobody threatens our sheriff and rides away to brag about it. The shift in mood was palpable, like the change in air pressure before a thunderstorm. The men who had come to the square planning to kill Webb in the name of justice were now facing the reality that he was far worse than they had imagined, and their anger was transforming from a desire for vengeance into something more principled, a genuine determination to see justice done properly. Webb sensed the change as well, and his hand moved to draw his revolver. Enough talking, he snarled. Rodriguez, you're coming with me. Anyone who tries to stop me is going to regret it. But, as Webb's gun cleared leather, he found himself facing not just Thomas Mitchell or Sheriff Garrett, but a semicircle of armed men who had finally understood what they were really fighting for. These weren't vigilantes anymore, they were citizens defending their community against a predator who threatened everything they valued. The gunfight that followed was brief and decisive. Webb managed to get off one shot that went wide before he was cut down by a crossfire that seemed to come from every direction at once. His three companions, seeing their leader fall, attempted to flee but were quickly surrounded and captured by men who had spread out around the square. When the gunpowder smoke cleared, Marcus Webb lay dead in the dust of Harmony Springs Central Square, his reign of terror finally ended. But the manner of his ending, facing armed resistance from an entire community united in defense of justice rather than vengeance, would become the stuff of legend throughout Central Texas. Thomas Mitchell stood over Webb's body, feeling no satisfaction in the man's death but a profound relief that it was finally over. Around him, his neighbors and friends were checking their weapons and helping Sheriff Garrett secure the surviving outlaws. Eduardo Rodriguez walked slowly to where Webb's body lay, staring down at the man who had murdered the Morales family and then spent months hunting him across Texas to silence the only witness to his crime. It is finished, Eduardo said quietly, then looked up at Thomas. Senor Mitchell, I do not have words to thank you for what you did. You risked everything to protect a stranger. Thomas removed his hat and ran his hand through his hair, suddenly, feeling the enormous weight of what had almost happened. I didn't do it to protect you, exactly, he said slowly. I did it to protect us. All of us. To make sure we stayed the kind of people we want to be. Sheriff Garrett approached with one of Webb's captured men in handcuffs. Thomas, I owe you an apology. If you hadn't spoken up when you did, we would have let Webb murder Eduardo and called it justice. That would have been something we'd have had to live with for the rest of our lives. Big Jim Hawkins, who had been silent since the shooting ended, finally spoke up. Thomas, I still don't understand how you knew. What made you believe the Mexican story over everything we thought we knew about the situation? Thomas considered the question carefully before answering. I didn't know, he admitted. Not for certain. But I realized that if we were wrong, if we let an innocent man be killed while we stood and watched, we'd become the very thing we were trying to fight against. Sometimes you have to choose between what's safe and what's right, even when you can't be sure which is which. Maria Rodriguez had approached during this conversation, carrying the wooden horse that had belonged to little Ana Morales. She offered it to Eduardo, who took it with gentle hands. The Morales family can rest now, Maria said softly. Justice has been done. As the sun began to set over Harmony Springs, the residents of the town began to disperse, returning to their homes and businesses with a new understanding of what they had almost lost. They had come within minutes of becoming a lynch mob, of letting their anger override their principles, of allowing a murderer to manipulate them into becoming accessories to his final crime. Instead, thanks to one man's willingness to stand alone against his own community when principle demanded it, they had remained true to the values they professed to cherish. The law had prevailed, justice had been served, and an innocent family's deaths had finally been acknowledged and avenged properly. Thomas Mitchell walked home that evening with the knowledge that he had risked everything he had inherited, his reputation, his influence, his standing in the community, for the sake of a principle that couldn't be measured in acres or cattle or dollars. He had discovered that some things were more valuable than the approval of his neighbors, more important than the safety of fitting in with the crowd. The story of what happened in Harmony Springs' Dusty Square spread quickly throughout Texas, told and retold in saloons and at church socials, around campfires and at cattle auctions. It became a story about courage, about the difference between justice and vengeance, about the moment when a man has to choose between what's popular and what's right. But, for Thomas Mitchell himself, walking home through the gathering darkness to his ranch house where his wife waited with questions and concerns, the day's events had taught him something simpler and more profound. He had learned that true strength wasn't measured by how much land you owned or how many men followed your lead. True strength was measured by your willingness to stand alone when standing alone was the only way to remain true to yourself. Eduardo Rodriguez and his family stayed in Harmony Springs, where he continued to work as a blacksmith and farrier. His children grew up as full members of the community, and his testimony in the trial of Webb's surviving gang members helped ensure that justice was finally served for the Morales family and all of Webb's other victims. Sheriff Garrett kept the wooden horse that had belonged to little Ana Morales on his desk as a reminder that law and order meant protecting the innocent, not just punishing the guilty. And Thomas Mitchell, when people asked him in later years why he had made the choice he did that day in the square, would simply say that sometimes a man has to decide what kind of person he wants to be, and then have the courage to be that person regardless of the cost. The dusty square where it all happened was eventually paved over as Harmony Springs grew and modernized, but the story of what occurred there lived on. It became a reminder that in moments of crisis, ordinary people can choose to do extraordinary things, and that the difference between civilization and barbarism sometimes comes down to one person's willingness to say no when everyone else is saying yes. Thomas Mitchell never regretted his choice, even though it took months for his relationships with some of his neighbors to fully heal. He had learned that leadership sometimes meant leading people in directions they didn't want to go, toward choices they didn't want to make, in service of principles they didn't want to acknowledge. But he had also learned that when the test came, when everything was on the line, the people of Harmony Springs were capable of rising to meet the challenge and choosing justice over vengeance, law over mob rule, and principle over convenience. It was, he often reflected in later years, the proudest moment of his life, not because he had shown courage, but because he had helped his community show courage when it mattered most. The stand he took in the dusty square wasn't just about protecting Eduardo Rodriguez or stopping Marcus Webb. It was about protecting the soul of Harmony Springs itself, ensuring that future generations would inherit a community built on justice rather than fear, on law rather than violence, on principle rather than prejudice. And, in the end, that inheritance proved more valuable than all the land and cattle and money that any one man could accumulate in a lifetime.